Thanks. Yeah, so I'd just like to echo Sophia's welcome to everyone, whether it's your first Marxism, third, millionth, you've been born in the crash at Marxism, you know, welcome here. And I think it's a really brilliant time to be having a space like this. But yeah, I mean, as people were coming in, I was playing a bit of Rage Against the Machine. That's not just because I'm young and love music that psychs me up, but I think Rage Against the Machine as a band, really, a lot of their music, it is incredibly aggressive and so on, but so well directed at the system that they live in and so on. So I thought that would be a nice way to sort of like set the tone of this meeting, really. But yeah, I mean, it's quite an important meeting to be having at this point, you know, just talking about whether we need violence or not. Because you think about, for example, I mean, only 2 or 3 months ago now was the UCU strike, where picket lines were just absolutely busy and bustling. And for whether you were actually on the picket lines or a student or so on, I think it brought out a lot of interesting discussions. I mean, people who are seeing like busy picket lines like this for the first time going, you know, why won't they leave me without like leaving me a leaflet and so on? It's like, you think that's right. I mean, picket lines before physically used to stop scabs from coming in, and we've, you know, perhaps that's something we'd like to come back to. But, you know, a lot of people consider picket lines traditional violence. Or you think about, you know, the debates that are coming up with the rise in racism, really. I mean, I've been running the Socialist Workers Student Society at Queen Mary for the last 2 years. And especially since the election of Trump, and the shocking rise of the FLA and so on since last summer, a lot of the time when we're having discussions and meetings, people will come and say, you know, we can't fight hate with hate, we've got to fight it with love. And before you know it, you're again in a debate about you know, the role of violence or whether violence is justified or not. So it's an important meeting to be having at this particular point. And really, if you think about it, any time revolutionaries and radicals and the left resist the status quo, it's immediately slammed as dangerous, aggressive, and really those people involved as nothing but troublemakers. You know, revolutions have historically been portrayed as violent and bloody coups, or at the very least, they've been seen as inescapably bloody and violent. So perhaps they don't intend to be like this, but it always ends up like this. You can't escape it. But the reality is really different, to be honest. I mean, movements are constantly polarized over the question of violence. You think about the civil rights movement. On the one hand, you had the NAACP, you know, headed up by Martin Luther King, who wanted a constitutional route, but in terms of the movement they wanted on the streets, they wanted a peaceful, non-violent movement. And on the other hand, you had more radical sort of figures coming out of the 60s and so on, like the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, had completely different ideas and were totally ready to take on the state. Or you think about the women's suffrage movement in Britain, you know, the suffragettes and suffragists, another polarization there. Really, I mean, a third, if we were to add one, is the Indian liberation movement as well. Gandhi was one part of it, you know, the non-violent direct action. But another part of it was things like, you know, people going down and burning stations of police officers, I mean, British general officers and so on, or perhaps peasants going on riots and so on. So actually, movements have constantly been polarized around the question of violence. So I suppose it brings us really to where do we stand? And as materialists, we've got to start by looking at the world we live in that's riddled with violence, bloodshed and destruction. I mean, in the 20th century alone, 191 million people were killed as a direct result of war. We're only at the beginning of the 21st century, opened by wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, but particularly to use the examples within the Middle East, you know, you think about the Iraq War, 300,000, probably more to be honest, killed during that war, and spanning till now, the war in Syria, more than 500,000 and counting have been killed already, and that's just one region. But moving away from war and calamity as well, I mean, there's violence that plagues our everyday lives. I mean, in December, The Guardian reported that 1 woman is left dead every 3 days by domestic abuse. You think about Grenfell, the ongoing inquiry has ruled that the tower was actually a living death trap. simply because the council and the big buyers didn't want to invest the money into safe fire regulations and safety regulations and so on. And to be honest, I mean, having spoken to people who are from the bereaved families and survivors and so on, you know, what the inquiry is really revealing was that they didn't actually care if the building had burnt down at all. Actually, it was a massive favour to them if, you know, there was space for new constructions and so on. So they didn't care for things like safety measures and all of that. And really, their priority was luxury homes, or at least making the building look pretty, as we all know with the cladding. Or you look at one of the costs of austerity. I mean, since 2010, over 3,000 people have died each winter. So this is spread out on average. 3,000 people have died each winter due to poor heating, despite this being the 21st century as well, simply because they can't afford it. I mean, globally, one person commits suicide every 40 seconds. And with the world slipping into deeper economic turmoil and chaos, I mean, people are predicting that by 2020, it's going to be one person commits suicide globally every 20 seconds. So we live in an incredibly violent world, and all of these examples, being examples that are extremely common and claim and destroy the most lives, make evident that the biggest source of violence really is the capitalist system that we live in, that protects the interests of the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, the people who own at the top. But this is the same ruling class, whether you're looking at the politicians or the media. Whether you're looking at the politicians or the media, who have the deep hypocrisy to claim to be against violence, only when it means cracking down and vilifying those who resist them. So you think about the Daily Mail, really. I remember actually last summer, after the snap election result had happened, the Tories didn't get the win that they wanted, and Grenfell happened as well, and the Tories really survived that period, I think, by the skin of their teeth. An article came out by the Daily Mail after this demonstration to kick the Tories out was called, attacking 3 different activists, one from Movement for Justice, one from the Socialist Party, and myself from the SWP. And all I remember was going into work. I was a kitchen porter at the time, and all I had was lots of aggressive messages. Oh, you guys are trying to hijack something that's a tragedy. Oh, this is not a political issue at all. You guys are trying to make trouble. You guys are starting all the violence and so on. Actually, there was more horrible abuse than just that. And then I find out that actually all of these sort of horrible ideas that people I didn't even know were messaging me with all came from an article that the Daily Mail had printed using my name and picture and everything. And the hypocrisy of that, I mean, you think about it, this is the same Daily Mail that inspired Darren Osborne, you know, the Finsbury Park attacker. I mean, I think this piece of art is absolutely brilliant in showing the role of right-wing papers like The Sun and the Daily Mail in the Finsbury Park attack. So that's a drawing of the scene there. Obviously people can see that there's logos there. But you know, this man was an avid Daily Mail reader. And there's many other different headlines and so on that they've had that sort of encourage people to hate one another and hate each other. I mean, at the same, just to talk more about Darren Osborne and the violence how violent he actually was as somebody who is a Daily Mail reader. I mean, he didn't want to just kill all Muslims, he actually wanted to go and kill Corbyn as well. So this is somebody who has an issue with the left as well as different communities and so on. And this is the same Daily Mail that calls human rights a farce, had a headline saying, "Hurrah for the black shirts," earlier in the 20th century as well. A paper that really inspires a lot of hate and a lot of aggression in our society, alongside papers like The Sun, really. Or you think about the 2011 riots, you know, rather than seeing it as protests as it had began initially involving families and friends of Mark Duggan, that escalated later into riots, you know, really because of the anger that was felt after yet another black man was killed in Tottenham, and there's a huge history in this. You know, the media and politicians tarred it as uncontrolled violence from hooligans and criminals, and they did the same thing when riots broke out in Hackney last summer after Ashan Charles was murdered by the police. You know, they never condemn, in those situations, you never see them condemn the violence of the murders of the police, the actions of the police that trigger all of this, just the anger and violence that comes from below in reaction to that. So it's not at all an objective thing either. And this hypocrisy that exists has clearly stood to protect and legitimize the violence of the ruling class, but at the same time crush and repress any violence or outcry that comes from the bottom in reaction to it. But if you listen to the ruling class and the mouthpiece they have in the media, I mean, they will say it comes down to human nature. We live in an inevitably and inescapably violent society because humans are selfish and prone to doing bad things to one another because of it. You know, and much of the state is built around this sort of underlying notion as well. You think about prisons built to detain people, or having police walking through your streets with batons, guns in places like America and so on. You know, the ruling class say that they need all of these institutions that make up the state to protect us from each other and our own inescapable human nature. But I think we should be absolutely clear as revolutionaries that we absolutely reject this. I mean, firstly, we reject the idea that we have a fixed human nature, let alone one that is cold and selfish in how we live and breathe amongst one another. And if people want to discuss that more, the notion around human nature, there will be a meeting on Sunday that particularly deals with this. So I encourage people to have a look at the timetable and so on. But secondly, really, I mean, the notion that it's human nature, when you try to apply it to instances of violence historically or things that are going on now, it's just far too abstract and it doesn't really add up. I mean, you think about the Iraq War. Was it because of human nature that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had to die, civilians, most of them? Or was it because the Western imperial ruling classes wanted oil and to protect their interests in the region? You think about Syria. Hundreds of thousands are dying because are hundreds of thousands dying because they are all out for themselves and don't want to help each other? Or is it because they are being bombed by their own ruling classes from the Assad regime, as well as the old invaders from Iraq? Again, you see Britain and the US playing a part here again. You think about last summer when 4 young black men, that includes Rashawn Charles, were killed just alone in that summer in Britain. Was it because people were violent? Was it because they were violent and destructive, as the police and politicians would have us believe? That people broke out into, that anger happened, that those 4 black men were killed, or any of the consequences of those police murders? Or was it because the police and the state have a history of combining brutal violence and deep-seated institutional racism, which keeps people divided? Why were those 4 young black men killed? We could even look at this summer, to be honest. I mean, the number of Palestinians murdered by the Israeli state over the course of the Great Land March that had been happening. Are all of those deaths of innocent civilians, women and children included, because of human nature, or even because Arabs and Jews hate each other, as they'd like us to think? Or is it because the Israeli state, backed by much of the global ruling class, particularly in the US and the UK, is it because they want to suppress and cleanse the Palestinians whose land they occupy and who they oppress because of it? It's absolutely clear that the violence doesn't come from us. The violence doesn't come from us all, and not all of us equally, let alone from a supposed human nature. It starts from a system. It starts from the system that we live in, that is built to protect the people at the top of it, with the money, the power, and the resources to cause so much devastation. I mean, there's a quote here from Vladimir Lenin. I mean, we've just passed the centenary, but he describes the relationship between the state and the ruling class in this way. In his book State and Revolution. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organisation of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters. I mean, what Lenin is really saying here is that the state is not a neutral body at all, completely undermining the status quo sort of idea that the state is a neutral force that protects us, what I was talking about earlier with, what people would argue the role of the police, prisons and so on are. Lenin is here saying all of these institutions that create the state aren't actually neutral at all and don't actually serve that purpose of protecting us from our own, to use Hobbes' word, brutish nature. You know, the state is a structure, and this includes the prisons, the army, the police, and so on, to maintain the dominance of the bourgeoisie and uphold their position at the top of society, exploiting and oppressing those at the bottom. And I think the thing that really shows that the most here is this is a photograph from the independence struggle in Catalonia. And lots of photographs came out from these particular demonstrations, but you see the firefighters on the one hand protecting the demonstrators, and here riot police sent by the Spanish state attacking them. And there's more horrible photos than this, but I think this one makes the point quite clearly. I mean, to somebody who sees the state as a neutral body that is there to protect us and essentially make our lives easier, it doesn't make any sense. If firemen are supposed to protect people and police are supposed to protect people, why in their uniforms are they having to fight each other? One of them is not there to actually protect the people, and I'd say it's the police. They're there to protect the interests of the state, which was actually to make sure that the referendum in Catalonia didn't happen, that they kept a massive part of their country and so on, a massive source of their revenue and labour and all sorts. I think this picture really sort of illustrates the reality of what the state is, and you know what role the state actually plays in society. So we've accepted that capitalism is inherently violent and the ruling class will protect themselves. So what do we do? I mean, I'd like to be absolutely clear that we want a world with no violence. That's part of our vision as revolutionaries. But the strategy of non-violence is a problem, I think. You know, for people like Martin Luther King, and even more so Gandhi, they pursued a non-violent strategy because they saw all violence as bad and the same. You know, after riots broke out, sorry, before I go on, you know, this is, and I'll explore this later in the meeting, but this is far more so with Gandhi than Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King actually evolves and radicalizes towards the end of his life, but I'll come back to that. But, you know, going back to, you know, treating all violences as the same, I think a stark example is the riots that followed the Amritsar Massacre in India, you know, where the Amritsar Massacre, for those of you who don't know, this is British officers open firing on a peaceful protest of unarmed people, so this included women and a number of children as well. And in open firing on them, they killed almost 400 people, women and children included. It was a horrific event, so you know one can understand that the response to that was a response that reflects complete distrust and alienation from those who are supposed to protect you. But nonetheless, I mean, Gandhi's response to these riots was actually a response of condemnation. So he condemned the people in Amritsar and condemned the British officers the same, when actually the situation was far more complex than, you know, just violence is breaking out in Amritsar, and the roles of, you know, the people and the British officers are completely different. But nonetheless, you know, Gandhi condemned violence on all parts after Amritsar. And the problem of non-violence as a strategy, as the example I mentioned shows, is that it can often be quite abstract and moralistic. I mean, as a Marxist and as a revolutionary, I'm a materialist. And as we as materialists can't leave the question of violence to be a moral question, to be honest. To be a moral question. I mean, it undermines and that's mostly because it undermines, you know, your grip of the relation in society, the dynamic in society of oppressor-oppressed. Much like Gandhi had with, you know, the example of his response to the riots and so on after the Amritsar massacre. And other examples of this in Gandhi's political career are things like, you know, when he would organise with peasants, he would say, okay, well, look, okay, if you're going to be mobilising and so on, he would have conditions such as, you know, be respectful to the landlords. You know, if you're a peasant and the landlord is the person who's exploiting you and so on, you know, the whole part is actually putting pressure on them to really give you your demands and so on. But for Gandhi, we would argue that actually we should be respectful to them. And similarly, when he organised with workers, he would ask for the condition of, you know, no intimidation of scabs. I mean, I spoke about picket lines earlier, and, you know, people on the left seeing that as traditional violence, but the whole point of a strike, you know, not only is withdrawing your labour, but also, I mean, for people who aren't joining you, the picket line is a tool for actually saying, don't go into work, you're going to undermine our strike. But, you know, Gandhi's condition would often be that, you know, no intimidation of scabs whatsoever. Scabs being people who continue to go to work during a strike, for those of you who don't know. As with Martin Luther King, he was farther to the left than Gandhi and was far more closer and more understanding to the masses than he had been, really. I mean, which meant that by the end of his life, while he pursued non-violent direct action for what often people celebrate Martin Luther King for, I mean, by the end of his life, he was actually somebody who was a huge critic of the US government, somebody who condemned the US's action in Vietnam, which was something that really sort of caused a break between him and the Johnson administration. But also, I mean, the last campaign that Martin Luther King was involved in was a strike. It was actually supporting the strike of the sanitation workers in Memphis, which was a really key part of history in the civil rights movement, taking on the more social questions to do with race as well. Clearly, I mean, Martin Luther King did radicalise by the end of his life, whereas Gandhi, you know, always remained a liberal and stuck very firmly to, you know, the politics of non-violence. And I mean, if you think about Martin Luther King ending his last campaign being supporting the sanitation workers in Memphis, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, when the naval soldiers went on strike in Bombay and actually were coming out and supporting and actually engaging themselves in the Indian liberation movement, this is about 1946. This was really a key piece of action that actually pushed the British out. I mean, you have the naval soldiers and everything coming out not just on strike, but actually mobilising with the people now, and it began to really tip the balance of power that the Indians were sort of unfavoured on with the British. But Gandhi's response to this was, you know, actually denouncing this strike and saying that it shouldn't be happening and so on, we can pursue other courses. And, you know, I don't think he ever recognised the importance of that strike to kicking the British out by the end. But, you know, the two are very, very different by the end of their lives, even though they start quite similar. You know, and I suppose this really brings us to the question of why non-violence won't deliver. I mean, firstly, I think it relies far too much on the morality of the ruling class. I mean, Gandhi ended the Salt March in 1931 to enter talks with Lord Irwin, despite the fact that he had huge opposition to this. But Gandhi preferred what he called peace with honour, rather than continuing the mobilisation that forced them in the first place to the negotiation, you know, the mobilisation of masses and so on, that put huge pressure on the British. And further to that, I mean, it underestimates the severity of how much the ruling class will use force and whatever necessary to protect themselves. I mean, Millbank is another example of this, really. I mean, what happens in 2010? Students put their faith in the Liberal Democrats and the promise to scrap tuition fees and so on. They enter a coalition government, and people are, you know, understandably incredibly disappointed, because it's, you know, of course this is something that, and still does, you know, shape the futures of young people like ourselves today. But this is more than just about, you know, paying and so on. It's about education as a universal right, but also the futures ahead of young people. So people, of course, mobilise really, really well around the student movement, and people poured out onto the streets. But, you know, once that promise was broken and the students had done that, when they got to Millbank, I mean, they got kettled, battened, and all sorts by the police. The treatment of the student demonstrations, I remember it was on I was in secondary school at this time, but it was on the news quite a lot, and all you could see was, you know, angry footage of police sort of holding down students onto the floor and so on. That was the response by the government to people who had a clear sort of political issue with them and were frustrated with a government that they were quickly becoming disillusioned with. Really, I think non-violence non-violence politics can't explain or deal with the question of riots properly either. I mean, that moral judgment that all violence is bad and the same essentially means that they can't differentiate between oppressor and oppressed in a situation. If you have a moral judgment against violence, you know, that differentiation becomes harder, and you end up actually mitigating your understanding of that sort of dynamic. And really, I would like to argue that non-violence is irresponsible. You know, when we know that the state will use absolute force to maintain itself and keep people in their place for the sake of the ruling class. You think about the crackdown of the Spanish state against the Catalans earlier this year, or riot police charging at you as they did with the student protests. You know, when the state is coming out in full force against you, what will you do? I don't think non-violence is actually a responsible decision in those circumstances. And I think if we want to change the society we live in, we have to accept that we will need to use violence to defend ourselves, and our collective power allows us to do that. You know, you think about things like the Spanish Civil War, you know, militias exploded onto the scenes, made up of ordinary people who are coming together to fight to defend the Republic from the fascist Franco. Or you think about the Black Panthers, you know, they had a campaign called Patrol the Pigs, where they would walk around with guns in their neighbourhoods, you know, walking through their streets and so on, really to keep an eye on the police, who were constantly coming into these neighbourhoods, mostly populated by African Americans, and treating them with, you know, exceptional brutality. But I think we need to also think about going further than defending ourselves from the state, really. And to do that, I think ultimately we have to have a vision of actually smashing the state. You know, if we want to start building the sort of society where without violence and without conflict or oppression. And this is where we might differ, I think, from anarchists who think that in order to do that, in order to smash the state, all we need is violence. Because yes, absolutely, you know, we absolutely accept that we need violence in order to defend ourselves, and violence will be a key part of overthrowing the ruling class. But we need a mass movement on the streets as well that can take on the ruling class and destroy the capitalist state. I mean, further to that, part of mobilising the masses, it precisely reduces the need for violence. The more people you have involved, actually, if you think about the people at the top, we always call them the 1%. You know, when you've actually mobilised the masses, that becomes more evident than ever, really. And that is what makes violence far more redundant in successful movements and so on. You think about the October Revolution, the centenary anniversary is just passed last year, but in comparison to the February Revolution in Russia, actually far less people were killed, let alone harmed, in the October Revolution. Even for historians who don't like the October Revolution, don't like Bolshevism, whatever their political differences are, they also see it as a coup. They call it a bloodless coup. There's this consensus that, you know, it was relatively bloodless. And why was that? What was the difference between February and October? Well, number one, it's that balance of power that I was talking about. You had the army involved, you had sailors from Kronstadt and so on. That balance of power, the state had nothing to reach to try to defend itself, and the balance of power is important. But what came before that? It was actually the mobilisation of the masses, really. You had a majority by the point of October, you know, peasants willing to revolt, but more so the working classes. And, you know, as I said, I mean, it ended up being something that was what they call a bloodless coup. So that's really the power of, you know, the collective and so on. Sorry if I'm stepping over your chairing role here. Because this is a workshop, instead of having sheets for everybody to look at, I thought, you know, as we go into the discussion, these are the questions that we can perhaps have a think about and so on. But yeah, I'll be returning to sum up. Thanks.